So hello, everybody. Allow me to offer you two sets of remarks about the fate of liberalism in our era. As everybody knows, in the past couple of years, liberalism has often been attacked as a kind of luxury item for the most privileged, for the powerful, for the winners. Liberalism, it's often been said, is for those who are definitely not among the left behind, the ones left out. It's not for, as a somewhat cliched phrase often has it, the losers of globalization or the losers of European integration. Allow me to counter that argument with two different sets of points. The first one is more empirical, the second one is more theoretical. First of all, the picture that we often get today, the contrast as in David Goodhart's very influential formulation between, on the one hand, anywheres who can flourish anywhere and somewheres who are somehow rooted in their surroundings, usually in the countryside, as opposed to supposedly cosmopolitan liberals who hail from cities, but who could really work in any city if they wanted to, in many ways is very misleading. For one thing, the immediate short-circuiting between a particular social position and then holding particular philosophical beliefs or values is often simply not there. It doesn't follow that those who happen to be particularly mobile, therefore necessarily, are also particularly liberal, let alone cosmopolitan, in any sense that is not completely superficial, as in, oh, I can eat sushi tonight and tomorrow we'll have Mexican. If it means anything like, let's say, a commitment to global justice, I dare say that it's sometimes the most immobile who have the most ambitious normative agendas, and sometimes those who are actually highly mobile by no means are necessarily committed to such ambitious ideals. As my fellow panelist Ivan Krastev pointed out recently, if it was all about mobility being a precondition for being a genuine cosmopolitan, how come that Immanuel Kant, of all people, was such a great cosmopolitan, given that he didn't really do a lot of traveling, but in fact hardly ever left Königsberg/Kaliningrad? Secondly, and even more important, those who are portrayed as the most privileged cosmopolitan liberals, in many ways, are actually not the real elites, the real decision-making elites. The elites in administration, in finance, in the economy, for the most part, remain deeply nationally rooted. It's simply not true that, I dare say, you or I or some of my students could simply pack up and decide that, oh, tomorrow we'll join the French elite because, hey, we are anywheres. No, in many ways, the really important elites remain deeply nationally rooted. And more important still, while we can all think of sort of counterexamples, supposed liberals from Silicon Valley, these sorts of elites also very often remain deeply conservative, certainly when it comes to their economic preferences. As has been shown many times, the, let's say, 0.01% in the United States actually are very supportive of Donald Trump because his economic policies align very well with their own, for the most part, very libertarian, but certainly not cosmopolitan liberal attitudes. Long story short, the often very uncritical acceptance of the anywheres and somewheres picture by liberals who feel that they need to be contrite, that they've done something wrong in the last couple of years, that they should be more self-critical, all of which of course are very laudable intentions. But this kind of uncritical and in many ways all too facile acceptance of what ultimately is an empirically misleading picture of the world has for the most part only had really one particular effect. And the effect has not been that those who are left behind, those in the countryside, all of a sudden say, oh, great, liberals are changing their minds. That's not what's happening. What is happening really is that, for shorthand, right-wing authoritarian populists will have succeeded in basically moving the political battle to culture and to convince people that the most powerful, the most oppressive, the most privileged, those who cause their misery, are intellectuals, teachers, professors, journalists, etc., etc. And those who actually, as I said a minute ago, remain the most consequential elites, essentially are not blamed and don't even enter the picture, as long as the picture is mainly about culture war. That was the first set of remarks. Let me move on swiftly to a couple of more general observations about liberalism, and I hope you will see how they relate to my attempt to counter the kind of anti-liberal culture war narrative. Obviously, liberalism is a very complicated tradition in the history of political thought, and I'm not pretending that anybody could do justice to it in about 2.5 minutes. But taking an inspiration from the American political theorist Judith Shklar, I want to draw a broad distinction between, on the one hand, liberalism as a distinct ethical ideal. In other words, the attitude where one says the best possible life is an autonomous life, but also a life where you try out what John Stuart Mill called experiments in living, where in a certain way it's true that it's about maximizing diversity, where it's true that the more variety life has, the more you taste, let's say, different cultures, the better life you have. I mean, that's not a caricature. Some liberals really have this ideal, and we can certainly debate to what extent that is an attractive one, or as critics might sometimes say, it's a slightly narcissistic, it's all about me, it's all about my experiences sort of idea about life. But that's only one understanding of liberalism, certainly something that was very prevalent in the 19th century with figures like Mill or Wilhelm von Humboldt. But of course, there's another understanding, what Judith Shklar called the liberalism of rights. And that is quite different from this idealization of autonomy. That is really the liberalism from which the weakest and the most vulnerable are likely to benefit the most, and where this picture of liberalism as something for the privileged and the most powerful absolutely doesn't fit. And last thing I want to say, those who today are often dismissed as advancing something called identity politics, where it's often said, oh, one of the great mistakes of liberals is that they now, have invested in all these ever more fragmented minorities and their particular concerns, and their, again, maybe overly selfish or narcissistic demands for recognition. It's very important, I think, to emphasize that when you look at the actual instances of what is derided as identity politics, so let's say Me Too in the United States or Black Lives Matter, it's simply not true that these are movements that are primarily about the need to recognize highly scurrilous, particular, almost incomprehensible experiences and identities, such that, according to the critics, society would break up into ever more fragmented little communities. It's a complete caricature. What these groups demand is something that actually should be and is, I think, completely comprehensible for all of us. A demand not to be harassed, let alone to be shot by the police, or a demand not to be harassed, let alone be raped by a powerful man. This is not something that others cannot possibly get their heads around. It precisely revolves around the liberalism of basic rights. And what in the times of the pandemic and COVID, I think has become even clearer, because COVID, after all, has been a kind of X-ray of our societies that has exposed something that was already there, but maybe some of us can see it even more clearly now, is the systematic vulnerabilities of some of these groups. Of course, initially there was a moment in the spring when people said, oh, pandemic affects everybody by definition. And on one level, that remains true. On another level, of course, we've also found that those who are relatively privileged can now, again, if I may go back to the 0.1%, go to their second homes, their third homes, their yachts, if they really want to self-isolate, then the real question is, do you bring the staff or not? I mean, worries that many others don't really have in our day and age. But those who were already most vulnerable and most exposed to the pathologies of our increasingly unequal societies, they now have their rights even more at risk. And I think liberals, rather than remaining entirely on the defensive and apologizing for things which they may well have done wrong, I'm not saying they're blameless, but instead of basically buying into this culture war narrative, should reassert the liberalism of rights and insist that rights are not a privilege, are not a luxury item, but are most essential for the most vulnerable in society. Thank you for your attention.
Now I should begin.